Hey y'all, welcome to Bible study. We are jumping right into Acts chapter 24, which opens with Paul in custody under Governor Felix. Verse 1 says, after 5 days of him being with Governor Felix, here comes Ananias, the high priest, a group of Jewish leaders, and a man named Tertullus. He's their spokesperson, the trial lawyer for the prosecution. Governor Felix calls Tertullus forward, and he begins in verse 2. I'll read it in the Message version. Most honorable Felix, we are most grateful in all times and places for your wise and gentle rule. We are much aware that it is because of you and you alone that we enjoy all this peace and gain daily profit from your reform. Blah, blah, blah. Get to the facts, Tertullus. Then in verse 5 and 6, he lays out the charges. Paul is apparently disturbing the peace, stirring up riots against Jews all over the world. He's the ringleader of a seditious sect called the Nazarenes. And finally, the only actual crime, they claim to have caught Paul trying to defile the temple. Then in verse 8, the lawyer tells Governor Felix, you'll be able to verify all these accusations when you examine him yourself. Where did they find this lawyer? Examine him yourself is the proof? Oh yeah, because Paul's going to plead guilty to all this foolishness. And he won't. When Tertullus is done, all the Jews against Paul are like, yeah, what he said. He ain't said nothing. Then in verse 10, the governor signals to Paul. It's his turn to speak. Paul starts, and there's no flattery. He acknowledges the facts. Governor Felix, you've been a judge for many, many years, and I appreciate the opportunity to represent myself. Paul said, you can check the records. I was only in Jerusalem for 12 days, and the only reason why I came was to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. I haven't started any arguments in the temple. I haven't worked up any crowds in the streets. I've been minding my own business, and I love how in verse 13 he says, where's the evidence? As a matter of fact, we're the witnesses for all of these accusations. Then he says in verse 14, I'll tell you what I am guilty of. Believing and following the way. They call it a seditious sect. But I serve and worship the same God of all of our ancestors. And I know and agree with everything in the scriptures. I want to specifically point out verse 15 where he says he believes in the resurrection of both the just and the unjust, the good and the bad. I want to point this out because part of our Christian life is believing that there is more after we die. We are not living just to make it here on this earth. We are living to live again with Christ. Many people are happy to talk about heaven, but very few are willing to address hell. With every single choice that we make, we are choosing where we will spend eternity. He continues in verse 16, going back to the line that got him slapped. But it was the truth, so why not repeat it? He said, I've done my best my whole life to live in good conscience with both man and God. Paul went on to describe that he had been out of the country for many years, and during all of his missionary trips, he had collected offerings to bring back to Jerusalem for those that were in need. Was Paul perfect, or did he think he was perfect? No, but he did everything he could to do what was right as best as he knew how to. Then in verse 18, he said it was Jews from Asia. Remember that terrible mob in Ephesus that started that riot? He's referring to them. He said they started this all up, and where are they now? Nobody in this room right now can say they saw me do anything wrong. There was absolutely no evidence for the accusations. Then in verse 22, Governor Felix said, okay, I've heard both sides, but I'm not ready to make a decision yet. Huh? Let me read verse 22. I'm going to read it in the Message version. He, being Governor Felix, knew far more about the way than he let on and could have settled the case then and there. But uncertain of his best move politically, he played for time. When Captain Lysias comes down, I'll decide your case. The facts were clear. Paul was innocent, and Governor Felix knew a lot more about Christianity, or the way as it was referred to during this time in history, than he was willing to let on. He was not a fair judge. He was an opportunist. I'm not going to get too much into the history of Governor Felix, but he was known for being evil, unjust, and corrupt, which really made the opening from Tertullus, the Jewish lawyer, that much more gag-worthy, because everyone knew they were just gassing his head to get in his good graces. Governor Felix knew that Paul was innocent, but did not want to be overtly on his side. And there are people today who know that the Bible is the truth, but for whatever reason, maybe fear of what their friends would say or their family would say, they choose to not overtly express that. They're just not bold enough to stand up for it. Let's not ever find ourselves in the middle like this when it comes to our walk with God. Revelation chapter 3 verse 16 says that God wishes that we would be hot or cold, because if we're lukewarm, if we're in the middle, he will spit us out of his mouth. I don't know about you, but I want to be on fire for God, overtly expressing that I am on the side of Jesus. But in verse 22, Governor Felix does not want to make a decision. He says he's going to wait for the chief captain. And then in verse 23, he commands that Paul be placed under house arrest. He knew he was innocent, so he didn't put him in the dungeon, but he also didn't set him completely free. But again, I'm reiterating divine protection, because God only knows what those Jewish leaders would have done to Paul if he were walking free on the streets. Now, something very interesting happens in the next few verses of this chapter. Governor Felix sent for Paul to come give him and his wife a Bible study. She was a Jew, and we already know he knows about the truth. Paul comes down, and verse 25 says he gives a Bible study on 3 topics: righteousness, temperance, which is self-control, and the judgment to come. When Paul was done, verse 25 said that Felix trembled, and he said to Paul, "Get out of here. I'll call you back when I have a little bit more time." I like the wording in the King James Version. He said, "when the season is convenient." Listen, there will never be a convenient season to stop sin. We have to go past convenience and starve our flesh of the things that are not of God, so that our flesh understands that God is in charge of our lives. I can judge Felix and be critical of him, but honestly, I'm convicted. And my prayer is, Lord, don't let me wait till it's convenient to do the right thing. Give me the strength and the courage to do it now. Verse 26 and 27, the last 2 verses of this chapter, to be honest, got me a bit tight. Because why has 2 years passed and Paul is still under house arrest? We all just read Felix said that he was going to talk to the chief captain and make a decision. In 2 years, y'all couldn't find time to have this conversation? But the truth is, the Bible says that Felix was looking for a payoff of some sort. One he was never going to get, but it just goes to show his poor motives and intentions. And verse 27 says a new governor, Porcius Festus, came to replace Felix, and Paul was still left in prison. And that's a wrap on Acts chapter 24. I'll be back with Acts chapter 25.